Now in today's video, we're going to talk about wide angle photography for wildlife and birds. This is part 2. And in part 1 of this series, we talked about things like focal length and field of view or angle of view, showed you a lot of wildlife images. Today's video, we're going to talk a little bit more about specifically birds. I think you're really going to enjoy this video, so stay tuned. Now, I want to show you before we get into some of these birds, because I'm a bird photographer and that's really what I'm dying to talk about. I want to show you what these angles look like. And I showed you out in my yard, but let me show you some real photos that I took at different focal lengths. This first one is a catbird. Now this is what kind of standard photography would look like with a longer lens. This is taken at 400 millimeters. I've got a little pond out my window, so I can actually shoot from my basement straight into this area and back. And I'll set up some rocks and stuff back there. I actually don't do a ton of photography as I like to get out into the wild, but it really is kind of fun watching them in there. Now I'm going to take that same image and just crop it vertically and show you what this will look like comparing it to other focal lengths. This focal length at 400 millimeters, I'm going to pop one over here about the same scale, about the same size. This at 100 millimeters, and it doesn't look drastically different. If I didn't tell you this was at 100 millimeters, you may not know it. But the reality is, where was that lens? In that first image, I was about 10 feet away. In this image, I had to be 4 times closer. Remember, we went from 400 millimeters down to 100 millimeters. So to get the same scale, I've got to be 4 times closer. So in this case, I'm going to just call it 2 feet. I'm around 2 feet away with that 100 millimeter lens to get a look that feels like this. When I take that down to 40 millimeters, I now have to be less than half as close as I was at 100 millimeters. So my 2 feet is now down to about 8 to 10 inches. So in this image, even though the bird is not as large in frame, I'm inside of 1 foot. Now we'll talk a little bit about this because this presents some real challenges. Can I get 10 feet away from a bird? Probably yes, with my 400 millimeter lens. Can I get 2 feet away from a bird with my 100 millimeter lens? You're asking a lot in that situation. Can I get 8 inches away with my 40 millimeter lens? That's probably going to be impossible. Not handheld. So when we're talking about wide angle photography, we're going to talk, when we get to some of the bird images, we're going to talk about techniques. How do you actually set it up? So we'll deal with that in just a minute, but I wanted to give you an idea of what these look like at different focal lengths and then what the actual distance was away from each of these focal lengths. But let's just get into the birds because that's really what I've been dying to do. Now I'm going to start with a larger subject, and in this case we've got a Canada goose. And it's just a wonderful scene. I'm just checking out the settings here. I'll put them up on the side. This one was taken at 20 millimeters. Not as far away from this goose as it looks. Without knowing the settings here, but talking to Nikki Nobles, who sent me this image, I think we were just a few feet away from this one. But notice this, the background. It takes part of this whole scene. Impossible to get this look from a long lens. So what you get from these wide angle lenses often are these very different looks. It often involves a lot of scenery, and I will say to produce really great wide angle photography takes a very creative mind and an intense focus on composition, because composition starts to move out of the wildlife realm and into the landscape realm, where it really just, that subject is now part of a much larger image and a much larger composition. It can be very challenging. Talking about big birds, this is a tundra swan. Really enjoyed this one. This one by Alex Perdidas. I've got another image by him. Going to try to have him as a guest on the show. I really love Alex's work. He's a follower and a friend on Instagram. This one taken at 35 millimeters. And again, we can see the background. Notice the small trees on the horizon up there. You can't get that. You know, you can't get that with long lenses. You just won't be able to reproduce that. One of the tricks, and I'm just checking the settings here on this, but one of the tricks is that you will stop down, meaning you'll take your aperture and close it down, and that will bring more of the background into focus. So some wide angle photographers will use that, stopping down to f8, maybe f11, maybe even f16, to bring more of the background into focus. In this case, I put the settings up here. This was taken at f2.8, but notice even at f2.8, you get a lot in focus. So you don't necessarily have to step down, but if you wanted to get it sharper in the background, that would be the technique, is to stop that background down a little bit. And Really, really great image. I really, really like that one. Now, in addition to shooting large birds, wide angle photography is amazing for shooting groups. You can't do this with these longer focal lengths. So it makes a lot of sense. In this case, we've got a penguin colony, really nice sky, mountains in the background. I really, really, really liked this image. This is by Felix Boulogne, and I just really, really, really liked the way that this was presented. And again, that wide angle look, much, much, much different than our longer lenses and works really, really great for groups. Speaking of groups, I've got another one here, and this one was sent in. This is by Randy Loden, and the gannet flying in with that colony of gannet on the rocks, converted to black and white, I think works really, really well for this one. Big, big fan of this image. And again, you see some of the patterns in the sky. I will, as a hint or as a suggestion when using wide angle lenses, when the sky has power, so when there's texture and color, and you'll notice a lot of clouds in these, sometimes we're gonna get color in just a minute, it's really, really effective. So let me show you one where we've got a single species, a little bit larger, not quite as large as those swans we dealt with, but this is a gull feeding on fish. And just notice the sky in the background. This is Shea Vabra, and the clouds and the color, it's just a great way using these wide angles. It's a great way to capture that. So I thought presenting sky wide angle, you can actually see it when you shoot in a compressed 400, 600, 800 millimeter focal length. The skies, you can get some of the colors. I'll give you an example. I've got a really pretty image over here. What I see there is the colors of the sky. I don't see the sky as a whole. I'm only seeing a small portion of that color. With images like this, you can see the vastness of a sky. So I thought a really, really nice image to show you there. And then we're gonna get into a little bit, I'm gonna show you another shorebird, getting a little smaller. And I don't wanna get too far off topic with depth of field. I am gonna show you this image. I want you to notice in all of the other images, we've been able to see the full bird. So the bird is exposed front to back, and that's depth of field. The depth of field on these smaller 50 millimeter, 40 millimeter, 35, 20, 15 millimeter lenses, the depth of field changes very quickly. And we often think of it as having a wider depth of field. But at close proximity, like this red knot, at close proximity, the field of view can be very, very thin, the same way it would be with a longer focal length. I will do a discussion on field of view and focal length in the future. I'm not going to do it for this video, but you will see, because the bird in this image is so close, the background is there. It's a wider field of view, but it is blurred out. That's that bokeh. There is bokeh there. This one shot at f1.4, so a very, very wide aperture, a very low number. F-stop number means a very wide aperture, and really, really lovely image. I have not seen a lot of this where birds have just a very shallow depth of field and a wide angle look. And that is achieved by proximity. You've got to be extremely, extremely close. And speaking of extremely close, I'm going to show you a couple songbirds here. This one by Jack Medeiros, wonderful photographer. This is a rose-breasted grosbeak. This one taken at 24 millimeters, just like a foot away. Like that's how close you are when you do these. I like this because often to get birds this close, we have to do something. I told you we talk a little bit about how to. With some of the other images, the larger animals, you can shoot it out of your car. The elephant, maybe if it's in an area you trust, you can shoot it handheld. Maybe you set up a remote. So you put it on a tripod or you set it on the ground and you're standing away and you're using a remote trigger. That's all very, very effective. I like this bird because it looks relaxed. Often when birds are called in using audio callback or some other distraction or some way to entice them, one of the things you'll see is they look aggravated or agitated. And this bird did not. That's why I featured him in the show. It just looked like a very calm, rested bird. I really, really like this. And then notice the background. This grasshopper sparrow, this one's singing. One of the neat things, and I told you a couple hints. Now, with most of these songbirds, you are going to be feet, maybe inches away. And that requires most often the use of a remote shutter. So you're going to set that camera up. This is a grasshopper sparrow. And what I loved about this is by Shenot, amazing photographer. Wonderful, wonderful guy. What I liked about this is grasshopper sparrows, like many birds, will find the same perch over and over and over again. So in this case, he's found the grasshopper sparrow's perch and just set up there and waited. In this case, using like a remote trigger, so not near there, but just waiting for him to come into that area. And what a lovely view. It's kind of like a prairie scene. And again, very smart. Notice the clouds. Like that just adds another layer. It adds more dimension to the photo rather than just a plain blue sky. So love that one. And I'm going to finish with my friend Josh Galicki. This is a wood thrush. Fantastic image. I've talked to Josh. He's done a couple of these wide angle, this at 32 millimeters with a remote trigger. All of Josh's wide angle work, or I shouldn't speak for him, but most of his wide angle work is used with the use of remote triggers and maybe even motion sensors. So kind of setting up in an area where the bird is hanging out or reliable, and then using motion triggers or triggering it manually to capture that. Love, by the way, we talk about composition a little bit on this show. Love the leading line. Look at that long branch, or that root actually leading up to the tree trunk. The moss and the texture in it, just an amazing image. A couple of things about wide angle photography, and I've said this a lot, and we're going to kind of wrap up the images and just talk about some of the pros and cons of wide angle in general. But one of the pros of wide angle photography is that it is often different. We don't see those songbirds taken at that focal length very often, and we don't see them in that environment like that. We don't see them presented that way very often. More common with larger species. I showed you the bison and the elephant. A little more common to use wide angle there. But when it comes to birds, it's a little bit tougher. So one of the pros about wide angle photography with birds is it's just going to be different. Now, I will tell you this, because I'm going to have some cons in here in a minute. Different doesn't always make it good. So different is a pro. Anytime you're different, I think there's an advantage there. But I have this saying that different is only different. Different is not good, and it can be or it cannot be. Any focal length can be good, any focal length can be bad. A few years ago, it seemed to be in vogue to attempt wide angle photography, and it's very difficult to do, by the way. I've tried it before, been very, very frustrated. I know the joy of trying something very difficult and then it happens. It doesn't mean the result was good just because it was hard to achieve. And I think for a lot of people, when this, I don't want to say when this was trending, but it was popular for a while, it wasn't always good. I tried to pick out some songbird images that I personally thought were very, very, very well done. So just because it's wide angle doesn't mean it's good. I showed you 3 examples or 4 examples of smaller birds that I thought were actually very, very well done. So congratulations to those of you featured on the show. I think you did a wonderful job. There are some other pros to this. And I would say probably in terms of advantages or pros, the uniqueness of what you can get with these is one of the biggest pros. Some of the other things is they can tend to tell a story. You tend to get more backgrounds, tend to get more environment. And with wildlife, it's really nice to put them into context. I love putting my subjects into context or into habitat. And in this case, I normally refer to this as macro habitat. So seeing the big picture, which we often don't get to see that big picture when we're using longer focal lengths. Some of the cons with this, some of the negatives around here, and they're pretty significant. The smaller the subject, the closer you have to be. And that can be pretty dramatic. I told you with my one catbird image that I showed you here, while it's fairly pretty, it had to be 8 inches away from it, which means I now rely on triggers or some remote device to capture it. There are some really unique things out there. I did a video on auto capture. I'll put a link down here so that you can reference that and what that means. But the Nikon Z9 has some amazing features. It basically acts as a trigger trap. The sensor itself is serving to detect motion and start to trigger without you being anywhere near it. Really, really great feature for the Nikon Z9. Most cameras don't have that, but there are some other companies that make that. I'm not going to go into a long video about, we would call this like trigger traps or remote triggers or motion sensor triggers. We're not going to talk a lot about that in this video, but I do want to mention as a con, it's just very, very, very difficult to do, and it might require some special equipment. One of the other cons, and I don't want to put this out there too negatively, but different doesn't mean good. Achieving really good wide angle photography can be very, very tough. when you think about as much as you are seeing, that wider field of view, that wider angle means that you're showing a lot. And that means you've got a lot to compose, a lot to think about, a lot that needs to be pretty. Not all environments work really, really great for this. Some environments are outstanding for this. I think it would be wonderful as a challenge to try to explore this a little bit with shorter focal lengths. Maybe even 100 millimeters can give you some very different looks. But I enjoyed putting this presentation together, putting this video together for you. I enjoyed putting some of the photographers into the video to illustrate what it can look like and how well it can be done. And I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed creating it. Now, I've got a lot of videos covering a lot of different topics. I've got some playlists down there. Feel free to check them out. If you're not subscribed to the channel, I would encourage you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you like the video, hit the thumbs up. There's a little bell for notifications. You can press that and it'll let you know when I have new videos coming out. I release about one a week. And hope you enjoyed the video. That's all I got for you this week. And as always, I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.